The way I see it, we've gotten to the point where our politicians in Washington really can't see the forest for the trees. There's such a lack of perspective now in Congress that we really can't expect these men and women to be the ones that solve the most serious challenges that our country faces. And I think that requires a slow process of bringing people into Congress who have right perspective and who have a different mentality about the role of government. You know, it's not the first time in our country that we've suffered through a lack of perspective among people in elected office. It was just 50 years ago that it was a lack of perspective and a lack of morality that caused black men to drink out of one fountain and white men to drink out of another fountain. You know, I think today it's a lack of perspective and a lack of morality that causes our politicians in Washington to think that they can somehow sustainably borrow money from the younger generation in this country, and a generation that's not even here yet, just to pay today's bills at a time when government is way bigger than it needs to be and has grown way outside of its constitutional role. And you know, I worry as a young person that 50 years from now, you know, people with a different perspective will look back, you know, say in history classes, and they will shake their heads at what became of this great experiment in freedom and self-government. And they'll wonder what happened to the descendants of some of the bravest men and women in the world who crossed the Atlantic to give rise to this nation, and that at a critical time in our country's history, when all we had to do to save ourselves was quit spending money that we didn't have the resolve or the gumption or the moxie to just do that. And we actually allowed our own gluttony to cause us to fall. That's where we are as a country. You know, I take a lot of inspiration personally from a young man who served in British Parliament in the 19th century named William Wilberforce, who served at a time where a lot of his colleagues and many of his older colleagues had lost perspective. And at 21 years old, William Wilberforce was elected. At 26, he had become the de facto leader of the movement to end the British slave trade, in large part because he was one of the few people with perspective in the Parliament that the slave trade was evil and that slavery as an institution was a scourge on their society. And so he began fighting tooth and nail as a passionate young man to end the British slave trade. And at 26, he put the first piece of legislation on the floor of Parliament to end it. And you know, it's really not surprising, given the lack of perspective of his colleagues, that he was kind of laughed out of the place. And they were more concerned at that time about what would happen to the constituents in port cities or the constituents in plantations. And many of his older colleagues just said, "Hey, young Wilberforce, you don't get it, man. This will actually cause the British economy to crumble." And they looked right past the moral issue at hand. And Wilberforce was seeing a wrong that needed to be right. And unfortunately, the politicians of the day were just worried about the political fallout. Well, that sounds kind of familiar. The good news is that Wilberforce was a determined young guy. And for the next 20 years, he worked on the hearts and minds of the British people, worked in the hearts and minds of his colleagues. And in his mid-40s, he was able to introduce a similar piece of legislation that ended the British slave trade. And it's a great example in history of where young people in the legislative body led a movement to shift the perspective to where it needed to be. We need that in this country right now. I want to be one of the William Wilberforce type leaders in this country, and hopefully see many more of those in my generation rise to the challenge to stare down our national debt and deficit issues and make the tough decisions, because our country is worth fighting for.